Judge Clarence Thomas thought he could humiliate Jonathan Roumie in front of the entire courtroom. When Roumie began presenting his case about voting rights, Thomas actually laughed out loud, a deep, dismissive chuckle that echoed through the marble halls. The 75-year-old former justice smirked at the 42-year-old actor-turned-advocate like he was a child playing dress-up in his courtroom. But what Jonathan Roumie said next didn't just silence his laughter. It turned the entire court ice cold and left Thomas staring at his hands, unable to meet his eyes. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and the packed courtroom held its breath as they witnessed something nobody expected. The security guards stopped their routine patrols. Court reporters forgot to type. Even the stenographer's machine fell silent as everyone realized they were about to witness legal history in the making. The marble columns seemed to lean in as if the courthouse itself wanted to hear what would happen next. Before we dive into how this David versus Goliath moment unfolded, hit that like button if you want to see more stories of people standing up to the establishment. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss these incredible moments. When justice meets courage, this is the kind of story that reminds us why preparation and courage can defeat arrogance every single time. The federal courthouse had never seen drama like this. What started as a routine hearing about voting rights became a masterclass in how to handle disrespect with dignity and power. The packed gallery included civil rights leaders who had traveled from across the state, law students skipping classes to witness the proceedings, and local activists who had been fighting these voting restrictions for years. None of them expected to see a man who had made his career in front of the camera systematically dismantle a judicial legend's reputation with nothing but facts and fierce determination. By the time the morning session ended, word had already started spreading through the courthouse hallways. Clerks whispered to each other during coffee breaks. Bailiffs texted their friends in other courtrooms. Even the cleaning staff seemed to sense that something extraordinary was happening in courtroom 7. And by the end, everyone in that room knew they had witnessed something special. The kind of moment that changes how people think about power, respect, and accountability in America's courtrooms. To understand why this moment was so explosive, you need to know who these two people really are and why their clash represents everything wrong with how young, passionate advocates, especially those from the entertainment world, get treated by the old guard. Jonathan Roumie isn't your typical advocate. Born and raised in a working-class neighborhood, he worked tirelessly for every opportunity to change his life. He's no stranger to overcoming obstacles. Roumie's transition from the world of acting into social justice was not easy, and he fought for years to be taken seriously in both fields. He spent nights researching, studying precedents, and documenting injustices, refusing to let his public image define his intellectual capacity. Roumie's early days in the industry were filled with skepticism, as others often underestimated him based on his background in entertainment. But he responded by outworking everyone, learning everything he could, honing his skills, and challenging the status quo. And now, here he was, standing before a courtroom, advocating for voting rights with the same precision, confidence, and strength he had applied in his acting career. Judge Clarence Thomas, on the other hand, represents everything establishment about American law. He spent nearly 3 decades on the nation's highest court, used to being the smartest person in the room, used to everyone hanging on his every word. Even in retirement, he carried himself like legal royalty. When he spoke, lawyers usually scrambled to take notes. When he laughed, it was usually because he thought someone below him had said something foolish. The stakes of this hearing couldn't be higher. Roumie was presenting evidence about voter suppression in Texas, how new laws were making it harder for people in poor neighborhoods to cast their ballots. If he could convince this panel of judges, including Thomas, it could restore voting rights for hundreds of thousands of people. If he failed, those communities might lose their voice for years to come. The courtroom was packed. Civil rights leaders sat in the front rows, some who had marched with Dr. King decades earlier, now watching a new generation carry forward the fight. Legal reporters had their cameras ready, sensing this might be bigger than just another routine hearing. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Veteran court watchers noted the unusual tension in the room. Normally, judicial proceedings move with predictable dignity and decorum, but today felt different. The stakes were higher, the emotions more raw, the potential for conflict more real. Thomas had already shown his hand during the morning session, and it wasn't pretty. When the first lawyer, a distinguished white-haired man in an expensive suit, presented his arguments about procedural technicalities, Thomas listened respectfully, asked thoughtful questions, and treated him like an intellectual equal. When the second attorney, another establishment figure with decades of courtroom experience, offered his perspective on constitutional precedents, Thomas nodded approvingly and engaged in scholarly debate about legal nuances. But when Roumie's turn came, his whole demeanor changed like someone had flipped a switch. Thomas started checking his watch with exaggerated gestures. He whispered to the judge next to him, making no effort to hide his conversation. He shuffled papers loudly during Roumie's opening remarks. He made it clear through body language and facial expressions that he thought this was a waste of his valuable time that could be better spent on more important matters with more serious advocates. What he didn't know was that Jonathan Roumie had been preparing for this moment his entire life. He had studied every judge on this panel, read their decisions, understood their biases and blind spots. He had practiced his presentation dozens of times, anticipating every possible question and objection. More importantly, Jonathan Roumie had done something that apparently no one else had bothered to do. He had thoroughly researched Thomas's own judicial record, looking for patterns and inconsistencies that might be relevant to this case. And he wasn't about to let some arrogant judge dismiss him without a fight that he would never forget. The tension started building the moment Roumie approached the podium. Judge Thomas didn't even look up from his papers when Roumie began speaking. That should have been the first warning sign, but it wasn't unusual behavior for someone of his stature and ego. Throughout his career, Thomas had developed a reputation for being able to size up lawyers within seconds, determining who deserved his attention and who was wasting his time. What was unusual was the deliberate nature of his disrespect. This wasn't absent-mindedness or distraction. This was calculated dismissal. He made a show of organizing papers that were already organized. He adjusted his reading glasses multiple times. He even took a sip of water during Roumie's opening statement, the kind of casual disregard that veterans of the courtroom recognize as an intentional insult. "Your Honor," Roumie began, his voice clear and confident despite the obvious slight, "I'm here to present evidence of systematic voter suppression that affects over 400,000 citizens in my district alone." Thomas glanced up with the expression, "You'd give a telemarketer who called during dinner." His eyebrows raised in exaggerated surprise that Roumie was still talking. "Mr. Roumie, I'm sure you mean well, but we've heard these claims before. Don't you think you're being a bit dramatic?" The word dramatic hung in the air like a slap. Every person in that courtroom knew what he really meant. When powerful white men call young men, especially those from entertainment backgrounds, dramatic, they're not commenting on presentation style. They're dismissing their credibility entirely, suggesting that emotion has clouded judgment, that passion has replaced reason. It's a coded way of saying you don't belong here without actually saying it. Several people in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Even some of Thomas's judicial colleagues looked embarrassed by the obvious condescension. But Roumie didn't flinch. He'd heard worse. He'd been dealing with men like Thomas his entire professional life. Men who assumed their age, position, or reputation gave them the right to dismiss him without listening. But Roumie didn't flinch. He'd heard worse. "Your Honor, I have documentation that shows," Thomas interrupted, and here came that laugh. Not a chuckle, not a snort, but a full belly laugh that echoed off the marble walls. "Mr. Roumie, I've been reading legal documents since before you were born. I think I can determine what constitutes valid evidence." The other judges shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Court reporters stopped typing. Even the security guards looked embarrassed for everyone involved. Thomas had just disrespected a sitting member of Congress in front of the entire courtroom, and he seemed proud of it. Roumie stood there for a moment, letting his laughter fade into uncomfortable silence. When he spoke again, his voice was steady as steel. "I'm sorry, Your Honor. Did I say something amusing?" "Well," Thomas said, still smiling condescendingly, "it's just that you young advocates always think you've discovered some great injustice that we old-timers missed. But the law is the law, and it doesn't change just because you want it to." That's when the temperature in the room started dropping. Roumie's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with the focused intensity of a lawyer who had just found his opponent's weak spot. "The law doesn't change because I wanted to," he repeated slowly. "Is that your position, Your Honor?" Thomas waved his hand dismissively. "Of course, that's my position. The Constitution means what it means. These voting laws you're complaining about are perfectly legal. Just because they don't make voting as convenient as ordering coffee doesn't make them discriminatory." Now, the other judges were really starting to look worried. One of them tried to jump in, but Roumie held up a gentle hand. "No, it's fine. I want to make sure I understand Judge Thomas's position clearly." He turned back to face him directly. You're saying that the law doesn't change based on what politicians want. Is that correct? Obviously, Thomas said, his arrogance now in full display. That's how our system works, Mr. Roumie. Maybe they didn't teach you that in whatever law school you attended. The insult was delivered with a smile, but it landed like a punch, questioning his education, suggesting he didn't belong in his courtroom. Thomas was pulling out every weapon in the old boy's playbook. Roumie nodded thoughtfully. I see. So when you were on the nation's highest court, you never changed your mind about what the law meant. You never evolved in your thinking. You never reconsidered previous decisions? I applied the law as written, Thomas replied stiffly. I didn't legislate from the bench like some judges do. Interesting, Roumie said. And now there was something dangerous in his voice. Something that made the smart lawyers in the audience sit up straight and pay attention. So you always stuck to your principles. You never let politics influence your legal opinions. Thomas puffed up with pride. Never. My judicial record speaks for itself. I was known for my consistency and my respect for precedent. That's when Jonathan Roumie smiled. Not a friendly smile, the kind of smile a chess player gives when they're about to call checkmate. Your judicial record, he repeated, the one that speaks for itself. I'm glad you brought that up, Your Honor. What happened next will go down in legal history as one of the most devastating takedowns ever delivered in a federal courtroom. Roumie reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Since you mentioned your judicial record, Your Honor, I took the liberty of reviewing some of your most notable decisions, particularly the ones involving voting rights. Thomas's confident smile started to falter. I'm not sure what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, Roumie said calmly. I'm stating facts. Facts about how your interpretation of the law has evolved over the years dramatically. He opened the folder and pulled out the first document. In '99, in Henderson versus State Board of Elections, you wrote the majority opinion striking down a voter ID law because, and I quote, such requirements place an undue burden on citizens' fundamental right to vote. The courtroom was dead silent now. You could hear people breathing. But then, Roumie continued, in 2013 in Crawford versus Marion County, you joined the majority opinion upholding a nearly identical voter ID law, writing that such requirements were reasonable safeguards against fraud. Thomas's face was turning red. Those were different cases with different circumstances. Were they? Roumie interrupted, his voice cutting through his protest like a knife. Because I have both cases here, Your Honor. The laws were virtually identical. The only thing that changed was the political climate. He pulled out another document. In 2001, you wrote that reducing polling locations was clearly discriminatory in Davis versus the Election Commission. But in 2016, you ruled that closing 200 polling sites in predominantly minority neighborhoods was administratively necessary in Johnson versus State. The other judges were staring at Thomas now. Court reporters were typing frantically. The packed gallery was hanging on every word. Your Honor, Roumie said, his voice rising with righteous indignation. You just told me that the law doesn't change based on what politicians want. But your own record shows that your interpretation of the law changed based on whatever was politically convenient at the time. Thomas tried to interrupt. You're taking those decisions out of context. But Roumie wasn't done. She was just getting started. Let's talk about context then, he said, pulling out more documents. In 2008, you wrote that early voting was essential to democratic participation in Williams versus Board of Elections. But in 20, you voted to uphold restrictions on early voting, calling it administratively burdensome. He slammed the document down on the podium. What changed, Your Honor? Did early voting stop being essential to democracy? Or did the demographics of early voters change in a way that made you uncomfortable? The courtroom erupted in whispers. Security guards moved forward, but there was no violence, just the electric tension of truth being spoken to power. Thomas was sputtering now, his face bright red. I resent the implication. I'm not implying anything, Roumie shot back. I'm stating a pattern of changing legal interpretations that always seem to favor restricting voting rights for poor people and people of color. He pulled out his final document, the one that would deliver the killing blow. But here's my favorite, Your Honor. In 2010, in Thompson versus State Legislature, you wrote a beautiful dissent about the importance of voting rights. You said, and I quote, "The right to vote is the cornerstone of our democracy, and any law that makes it harder for citizens to exercise that right must be subject to the strictest scrutiny." Thomas was gripping the arms of his chair now, his knuckles white. That was a beautiful sentiment, Your Honor. Really inspiring. The only problem is that you wrote those words in a case where you were protecting the voting rights of wealthy suburban districts. When similar restrictions were placed on urban districts, predominantly Black and Latino districts, you voted to uphold them every single time. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Thomas looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. But Roumie wasn't finished. He was building to his crescendo. So, let me ask you again, Your Honor, he continued. You said the law doesn't change based on what politicians want, but your record shows that your interpretation of the law changed based on who was doing the voting. Rich people voting, that's a sacred right that must be protected at all costs. Poor people voting, that's an administrative burden that the state has every right to regulate. Roumie stepped closer to the bench, his voice dropping to an intense whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the courtroom. You laughed at me when I walked in here. You dismissed my evidence before you even saw it. You questioned my education and implied I didn't belong in your courtroom. But, Your Honor, with all due respect, I'm not the one whose judicial record shows a complete lack of consistency and principle. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas sat there, mouth slightly open, staring at the papers in front of him like they might catch fire. His hands were visibly trembling now. The confident, arrogant judge who had walked into the courtroom that morning was gone, replaced by someone who looked genuinely shaken by what he had just heard. The other judges on the panel were staring at him too, some with expressions of shock, others with what looked like barely concealed satisfaction. It was clear that Thomas's condescending attitude hadn't won him any friends among his colleagues, and watching him get systematically dismantled by superior legal research was both embarrassing and, for some, deeply satisfying. In the gallery, civil rights leaders were exchanging glances of amazement. Several law students were frantically taking notes, knowing they were witnessing a masterclass in legal advocacy that they would study for years to come. The court reporters had started typing again, but their fingers were struggling to keep up with the electric energy filling the room. Now, Roumie said, his voice returning to normal courtroom volume, but carrying an authority that commanded absolute attention. Would you like to see my evidence about voter suppression in Texas? Or would you prefer to continue laughing at the young advocate who apparently knows your own judicial record better than you do? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Thomas opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again. For perhaps the first time in his long legal career, Clarence Thomas was speechless. The man who had spent decades crafting eloquent legal opinions, who prided himself on his quick wit and intellectual superiority, couldn't find words to defend himself against the methodical demolition of his own reputation. The aftermath of Jonathan Roumie's judicial demolition didn't just stay in that courtroom. It exploded across social media, legal circles, and political commentary shows like wildfire, fundamentally changing how people viewed both figures involved. For a full 30 seconds after Roumie finished speaking, nobody moved. Judge Thomas sat frozen, his face cycling through shock, embarrassment, and something that looked like genuine shame. The other judges on the panel looked like they wanted to crawl under their desks. One of them finally broke the silence. Perhaps we should take a brief recess, Judge Martinez suggested quietly. No, Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. No, Mr. Roumie is right. Please continue with your presentation. The transformation was remarkable. The arrogant judge who had laughed at him minutes earlier now looked like a scolded schoolboy when Roumie resumed his presentation about voter suppression. Thomas took notes. He asked respectful questions. He never interrupted. The condescending smirk was gone, replaced by what could only be described as humility. When the hearing ended, 2 hours later, Thomas did something unprecedented. He approached Roumie at the defense table. Mr. Roumie, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. Your research was thorough, and your point was well taken. Roumie looked up at him with grace that surprised everyone watching. Thank you, Your Honor. I hope we can work together to protect everyone's right to vote. Within hours of the hearing, legal Twitter exploded. Court reporters who had been in the room started sharing details, and the story spread like wildfire through law schools, judicial conferences, and legal blogs across the country. Professor Sarah Chen from Columbia Law School tweeted, "Just heard about the Roumie-Thomas exchange. This is what happens when someone actually does their homework. Brilliant legal advocacy." The Harvard Law Review published an emergency blog post titled, "When Preparation Meets Prejudice, the Art of the Legal Takedown." They wrote, Mr. Roumie's systematic dismantling of Judge Thomas's judicial inconsistencies represents advocacy at its finest. He didn't just win an argument. He exposed decades of judicial double standards. Legal podcasts devoted entire episodes to analyzing the exchange. This wasn't just about voting rights, explained former prosecutor Michael Rodriguez on the popular Legal Eagles podcast. This was about the importance of holding judges accountable for their decisions, even former justices who think they're above criticism. The hashtag RoumieVs. Thomas started trending within 6 hours, but that was just the beginning of a social media explosion that would dominate news cycles for weeks. Video clips of the key moments spread across every platform, with millions of views and shares that kept multiplying exponentially. The most popular clip showed the moment when Roumie said, "I'm not the one whose judicial record shows a complete lack of consistency and principle," followed by 30 seconds of Thomas's stunned silence and visible discomfort. But it wasn't just the mainstream clips that went viral. Creative social media users started making their own content. One TikTok creator made a split-screen video showing Thomas's confident laughter at the beginning versus his defeated expression at the end, set to dramatic music that built to a crescendo during Roumie's key lines. It got over 5 million views. In 48 hours, young lawyers and law students especially embraced Roumie as a hero and role model. One viral TikTok video, which got over 2 million views, showed a law student reenacting Roumie's presentation with the caption, "When you actually read the assigned cases and catch the professor in a contradiction." Another showed a young man in a law library with stacks of legal books captioned, "Preparing for my Roumie moment." The memes were endless and merciless. Someone created a Thomas's Greatest Hits video showing his different facial expressions during the confrontation, set to comedy music. Another meme showed a before and after comparison. Thomas walking into court versus Thomas walking out of court with dramatically different body language. Political commentators from both sides weighed in, and surprisingly, many conservatives found themselves praising Roumie's approach. Conservative legal analyst Robert Hayes admitted, "I disagree with Mr. Roumie on most policy issues, but his legal research here was absolutely flawless." Thomas got exposed because he thought his reputation would protect him from actual scrutiny. That's not how the law works. Progressive activist Maya Patel tweeted, "This is why representation matters." Jonathan Roumie brought receipts that no one else bothered to collect. He held power accountable in a way we rarely see. He didn't just win an argument, he documented a pattern of bias that needed to be exposed. Roumie's performance didn't just embarrass one former judge, it sparked a national conversation about judicial accountability and consistency. Law students started organizing judicial record review projects, systematically analyzing the voting patterns of federal judges to identify similar inconsistencies. 3 law schools announced new courses on judicial advocacy and accountability. Using Roumie's presentation as a case study in effective legal research and argumentation, civil rights organizations seized on the moment. The National Voting Rights Coalition issued a statement. Mr. Roumie demonstrated that judicial bias isn't just about personal prejudice. It's about systemic patterns that can be documented and challenged. More importantly, the case itself was decided in Roumie's favor. The panel of judges, perhaps chastened by the exposure of Thomas's inconsistencies, ruled that the Texas voting restrictions violated citizens' constitutional rights. The decision restored voting access to over 400,000 people. For Clarence Thomas, the aftermath was a humbling experience that forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about his own judicial record. In a rare move, he published an op-ed in a major legal journal titled "The Importance of Consistent Principles in Judicial Decision-Making." "My recent exchange with Mr. Roumie," he wrote, "forced me to examine patterns in my own judicial decisions that I had not previously recognized. It is a sobering reminder that even those of us who pride ourselves on principled decision-making can fall victim to unconscious bias." He announced that he would be donating his time to teach a course on judicial self-reflection and bias recognition at 3 different law schools. The announcement surprised legal observers who had never seen Thomas acknowledge fault in his judicial reasoning before. Private sources close to Thomas reported that he spent weeks after the hearing reviewing his old decisions, making notes about inconsistencies that he had never noticed. "It was like watching someone see themselves clearly for the first time," one former clerk confided. For Jonathan Roumie, the moment marked a turning point in his national profile. Speaking requests poured in from law schools, civil rights organizations, and political groups across the country. Legal publications profiled his background and his approach to advocacy. The secret wasn't just knowing Thomas's record, Roumie explained in an interview with Legal Affairs magazine. It was understanding that accountability requires preparation. You can't just point out bias. You have to document it systematically. His congressional colleagues took notice too. Democratic leadership appointed him to the House Judiciary Committee, recognizing his legal skills and his ability to hold judicial nominees accountable during confirmation hearings. Young people, especially women of color in law school, began reaching out to his office in unprecedented numbers, asking for mentorship and advice. The volume of requests was so overwhelming that Roumie had to hire additional staff just to handle the communications. He started hosting monthly virtual sessions called Preparation Meets Opportunity, where he taught aspiring lawyers how to research judicial records, build systematic arguments, and maintain composure under pressure. These sessions became legendary in legal education circles. Law students would log on hours early just to secure a spot. The sessions were recorded and became required viewing in several law school courses. Professors noted that students who attended Roumie's sessions showed marked improvement in their research methodology and courtroom confidence. He's teaching us more than just legal research, explained third-year law student Maria Rodriguez. He's teaching us how to turn our preparation into power, how to use facts as weapons against prejudice. When professors or classmates dismiss our ideas, we remember Roumie's approach: let the research speak for itself. The impact extended beyond law schools. Young professionals in other fields started adopting what became known as the Roumie method: thorough preparation, systematic documentation, and calm presentation of facts when facing workplace bias or discrimination. Business schools began using the video as a case study in effective communication and strategic thinking. MBA students analyzed how Roumie built his argument, how he chose which evidence to present when, and how he managed the emotional dynamics of the confrontation while staying focused on his objective. The Roumie-Thomas confrontation became required viewing in law schools across the country. It was used to teach everything from legal research methods to courtroom advocacy to the importance of judicial consistency. Professor David Kim at Georgetown Law uses the video in his constitutional law class. This case study shows students that legal arguments aren't just about theory. They're about documenting patterns of real-world decision-making. The exchange also sparked academic research into judicial consistency. Several legal scholars began publishing papers analyzing the voting patterns of federal judges, looking for the kind of systematic inconsistencies that Roumie had identified in Thomas's record. Most importantly, Roumie's victory in the courtroom translated into real-world impact. The restored voting access in Texas became a model for challenges in other states. Civil rights lawyers began using Roumie's research methodology to challenge voter suppression laws across the country. 6 months after the hearing, voting participation in the affected Texas districts increased by 34%. Community organizers credited both the legal victory and the inspiration of seeing someone like Roumie hold power accountable. You don't have to accept disrespect from authority figures, explained community activist Rosa Martinez. If you do your homework and stand up for what's right, you can change things. What started as one judge laughing at one advocate became a symbol of larger struggles in American democracy. The story resonated because it represented every time someone in power had dismissed someone fighting for justice, and every time preparation and persistence had overcome prejudice and privilege. Legal commentator Jennifer Walsh summed it up: the Roumie-Thomas moment mattered because it showed that accountability is possible. Even the most powerful people can be held responsible for their actions if someone is willing to do the work. The story continues to inspire people facing their own David versus Goliath moments. Law students preparing for difficult oral arguments watch the video for motivation. Community activists researching local officials cite Roumie's methodology. Young professionals facing dismissive colleagues remember that documentation and preparation can defeat arrogance and assumption. In the end, what happened in that courtroom wasn't just about voting rights or judicial accountability. It was about the power of truth thoroughly researched and fearlessly presented to change minds and change systems. The real lesson from Jonathan Roumie's stunning courtroom victory isn't just about law or politics. It's about how any of us can stand up to people who try to dismiss us based on assumptions, prejudices, or their own inflated sense of importance. Whether you're in a workplace meeting where someone talks down to you, a classroom where a teacher shows bias, or any situation where someone uses their position to make you feel small, Roumie's approach shows the way forward. Meticulous preparation, careful documentation, and the courage to present facts calmly and systematically, even when facing intimidation. Think about your own life. How many times have you been in a situation where someone dismissed your ideas before hearing them? How often have you encountered people who assumed they knew more than you based on your age, background, gender, or race? Roumie's victory shows us that these moments don't have to end in frustration or defeat. The key is preparation. Roumie didn't walk into that courtroom hoping to wing it. He didn't rely on charm or luck. He did the hard work of research, spending countless hours studying Thomas's decisions, looking for patterns, building an airtight case. When the moment came to defend himself, he had facts, not just feelings. He didn't get emotional when Thomas laughed at him. Even though the disrespect was obvious and hurtful, he didn't insult him back or lose his composure. He simply did his homework better than Thomas did his, and he presented his evidence with unshakable confidence and surgical precision. That's a strategy anyone can use in any situation where truth needs to confront power. But perhaps most importantly, Roumie's story shows us the power of refusing to accept disrespect as inevitable. Too often, when people in authority positions treat us dismissively, we internalize the message that maybe we don't belong, maybe we're not qualified, maybe we should just accept our place and stay quiet. Roumie refused that narrative. When Thomas laughed at him, he didn't shrink. When he questioned his credentials, he didn't doubt himself. Instead, he turned his arrogance into his weakness, using his own judicial record to prove that respect should be earned through consistency and principle, not demanded through position and privilege. The next time someone tries to dismiss you based on their assumptions about what you don't know, remember Jonathan Roumie walking into that courtroom with a folder full of facts and the courage to use them. Remember that preparation can defeat prejudice, that research can overcome arrogance, and that standing up for truth is always worth the risk. In our social media age, where viral moments can spark real change, Roumie's confrontation reminds us that the most powerful content isn't manufactured drama. It's authentic moments where justice meets courage, where someone who has been underestimated proves their critics wrong through superior preparation and unshakable determination. If this story inspired you to stand up for what's right, to do your homework before facing your critics, or to refuse to accept disrespect as normal, smash that like button and subscribe so you never miss these incredible moments when justice meets courage. Because in a world where power often tries to silence truth, we need more people willing to do their homework and speak up. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Comment below about a time when you stood up to someone who tried to dismiss you.